Hello, welcome to Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. I am Robert, the narrator, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Confessions. This episode of Confessions, I'm going to discuss some of the things that, as a game master, I have to constantly keep in the back of my mind because I don't do well in those particular areas as a game master. Something that I constantly have to work on because, of course, no one is perfect. I'm not perfect. I've been role playing for a long time, but there are still things that I'm not naturally great at. So I try to work on those. And so this episode, I'm going to discuss the areas where I have a couple of flaws and always have to be mindful of. So I think the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the fact that I tend to get into my own head when players aren't on their game. So I tend to be the kind of game master who really thrives off of player creativity. I think I do my best work when my players are doing theirs. And of course, there's all types of players out there. You have players who are never focused for multiple reasons. Maybe they're there with someone else and role playing games aren't really their thing. Maybe they're just individuals who don't have a great attention span or they're always on their phone. Those players are always distracted. Then you have players who are never distracted. Whenever they sit down to role play, they want to get something done. They're about their business. They're very interested in the game, whether or not what's going on is interesting to them. And then you have the player who is interested based on whether or not they find what you're doing at the time interesting. And sometimes, I'm a human being, and I feel like I try my best and I put a good amount of work into my games. So if I have a player who's not focused, who's not immersed, who's not involved, and not in the game, I sometimes it affects my performance as a game master. I'll be completely honest with you, and this may come off as kind of like when you're in a job interview and they ask you, so what are your weaknesses? And some folks will say, my weakness is I work too hard. This may come off as kind of like that, but it's not really. And my trick or tip for game masters who may have that issue is just to say that it's not one of those things where I'm trying to compliment myself as I'm pointing out one of my weaknesses. The truth is that every game master goes through this, at least the portion of it where at some times you're going to have players who are not always on point and really focused in your game, and they may be from one of those categories: guys who are always unfocused, guys who are only focused when something is interesting happening, or guys who are always focused. So you're going to go through that, and the trick or tip for that is that obviously you're going to have those games, and you should never allow it to affect your performance. But sometimes for me, I do let it get into my head, and I do let my performance, because it's like, hey guys, I'm doing all this work, and I don't feel completely appreciated. So that really happens as a game master. You have to realize you're going to have those games. Gather yourself up. Try to not let it bum you out, and come back next week, and in most cases, it will resolve itself. So that's one of the areas where I always have to say, hey, Robert, you're going to have these games. They're going to happen. No one has a perfect record of players always being focused and always getting a ton of stuff done. So just come back and get them next week. So that's one of the things that I constantly have to work on as a game master. The next thing that I find myself having to really not let affect my game mastering is I sometimes get bummed out when players ignore storylines. One of my games for one of my top 10 favorite RPGs of all time, which is an older game that I ran a few years ago, had a storyline that players were completely ignoring. And if players are ignoring a storyline that you continue to bring up, they're basically saying to you that they're not interested in the storyline, even though after pressing a little bit, no one actually came out and said, hey, I'm just not interested in that storyline. But their actions really said that. And I think as any dungeon master who puts in a good amount of work into their campaigns and who really take pride in what they're doing and want to give their players the best experience, it really does bum you out when the players are completely ignoring a storyline. I think that happens. Another thing that other game masters can relate to, players will always kind of throw you off, and no plan survives contact with the enemy, as they say. So I have to say to myself, hey, you'll get them next time. The players just aren't interested in this storyline. So, hold on to the storyline. Maybe you can revisit it later or with a different group of players. And something else that actually what led to the disintegration of one of my games is I had this ongoing storyline that players were ignoring. And I think a lot of game masters or players will tell you that they want to run or play in a world where events are happening. It's like the real world. Just because the players are ignoring a storyline doesn't mean that the world will stop marching on. And if the players ignore a storyline, if it's heading in a bad direction, narratively or whatever, and the players ignore it, whatever the bad outcome is from them ignoring it will happen. And that actually happened in my game because I had gotten to the philosophy or picked up on the idea that the world is a dynamic place, and just because players refuse to or aren't interested in interacting with a particular storyline that's running through the game doesn't mean that the world stops being real and dynamic and things stop happening because the players are not interacting with it. And the unfortunately, that was the undoing when it hit the fan. The storyline was ignored to the point where it really turned out fairly bad for the players, and they really weren't into the outcome for that. So, though I believe in that idea of a dynamic world that's real and things continue to happen even when the players refuse to deal with it, one of the times where I put that into practice didn't turn out too well. So maybe back to the drawing board. But as a game master, I like that idea. I think it's very realistic. It gives your world verisimilitude. And just because the players are ignoring something doesn't mean it's not going to continue to march on. Bad guys have their own plans and goals. And if you give the players enough of a hint as to what's going on and they decide to go in another direction, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that the world is going to stop. And that's what I've learned some lessons from that. But I think I really like that idea of a dynamic world. And I just have to, because it bums me out, sometimes, again, I get into my own head and wonder, hey, this storyline they're ignoring, am I allowing it to go bad and just come to fruition because I'm a little salty that they ignored it? Or is serving a dynamic game world or setting really a good thing? That's something that I always struggle with a game master. But I always have to keep in mind that yeah, don't get bummed out because the players are ignoring a storyline, and it may not be a revenge issue if the story comes to fruition and it's not great for the players. The next issue that I have as a game master that I have to keep an eye on when I'm running is sometimes I have a tendency to lose track of things during combat. Sometimes if it's a really large, intricate combat, I sometimes can lose track of which NPC is unconscious or which battlefield condition is still in effect and which is not. And I just have to, as a game master, I have to learn to keep more detailed notes, to keep track of what's going on, to keep track of initiative, to keep track of which players have gone and which players have not. So I'm kind of a big picture. And the next thing, I think the last thing that I need to constantly work on, even at my advanced age in the hobby, is I always struggle with no but and yes and. The idea you should always say yes to players if they give a suggestion story-wise or they ask for something. You should always try your best to give them what they want and to kind of assist you with that. You can always give them what they want, but with a catch, because if you just say yes, 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 yes all the time, number one, your players are going to get bored of your game because they know you'll give them anything they want. But if you can say yes and give them some consequences or make them work for what they want, or do a reasonable amount of work, you're still saying yes, but it's just not giving. And I always kind of struggle with that because I do I do a good amount of prep, not a ton of prep, but I do a good amount of prep. I usually have a good idea of what's going on in the world, what's going on in the campaign, what's going on in the current adventure, what's going on in a particular encounter. So most of the time when a player asks me, hey, what is this? Can this do this? Or does this mean that? I usually have in my mind established what is going on. So I sometimes struggle when it is appropriate to stick what you have already established in your mind that the players may not be aware of, and when to do away with what you have established on your own and allow the players to change it to make them feel a little better, like they're involved, and well, they are involved, but to make them feel like they really are a part of the world. And there's constantly a struggle in my head, or sometimes there's a struggle with just saying yes to cater to their feelings, or saying no enough to make sure that the game stays interesting and challenging and surprises the players. So I'm always working on that. So those are the things that I sometimes have to make sure that I'm not overlooking as a game master, things that don't come naturally to me that I'm sure other game masters are really good at. So what are some of the things you struggle with as a game master, or you've seen your game master struggle with? And if you have any tips, of course, this is always a dialogue, not a monologue. Go ahead and put some comments in the comments section below. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. And good morning or good evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.